The wolf's eyes held recognition. Staff Sergeant Kira Vance had seen those amber eyes before 35 years ago, when she was 5 years old and her father made a choice that defied every survival instinct. He had lowered his rifle. Let the predator live. Now, as she stood in the Alaskan wilderness on a classified mission, that same wolf stood 20 feet away, and somehow, impossibly, it remembered. What her father had understood that day in 1990, what he had tried to tell her before he died, was about to save her life in ways she could never have imagined. But that moment was still 3 weeks away. Right now, Kira stood in front of 42 soldiers at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, her breath forming clouds in the October air as she demonstrated proper shelter construction in sub-zero conditions. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, weaving spruce branches into a framework that would keep a person alive when the temperature dropped to 40 below. "You build from the inside out," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen training ground. "Not because it looks better, but because your core heat is what matters. Everything else is just buying time." The soldiers watched with varying degrees of attention. Some leaned forward, genuinely interested. Others shifted their weight, clearly wondering why they were learning wilderness survival when their deployment orders pointed to urban combat zones. Kira knew what they were thinking. She had thought the same thing once, before Afghanistan taught her that survival skills transcended terrain. A movement at the edge of the group caught her attention. Colonel Bradford Hutchins stood beside the training area, his arms crossed, his expression carved from the same ice that covered the ground. He had been watching for 10 minutes now, and Kira knew from experience that his presence meant trouble. She finished the demonstration, released the soldiers for Hansen practice, and walked toward the colonel. Her boots crunched through the frozen crust of yesterday's snow. The temperature was dropping fast. Another storm system was building over the Alaska range, and the sky had that peculiar gray quality that promised heavy snowfall before nightfall. Colonel Hutchins did not waste time on pleasantries. "Your father would have added more insulation," he said, gesturing toward the shelter she had built. He was always worried about comfort over efficiency. Kira felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone invoked her father's name like a criticism. "My father kept people alive in conditions that would have killed most soldiers, sir. His methods worked." "Worked," Hutchins repeated, his tone making the past tense sound like an epitaph. "Right up until they didn't." He pulled a folder from under his arm and handed it to her. "I have a new assignment for you, Staff Sergeant. Consider it an opportunity to prove that your survival philosophy is more than just your father's sentimentality." Kira opened the folder. The mission parameters made her stomach drop. 30 days, deep wilderness, minimal equipment, a training exercise designed to push soldiers to their absolute limits. She scanned the details, her mind automatically calculating supply ratios, caloric needs, emergency protocols. "This is scheduled for November," she said. "The weather windows are completely unpredictable that time of year, which makes it realistic training," Hutchins replied. "Real combat doesn't wait for ideal conditions. You're always talking about respecting nature and working with the environment. Here is your chance to demonstrate that philosophy under actual pressure." The team roster was attached. 12 soldiers, most of them barely out of advanced training. 2 had never served in cold weather environments. It was a setup designed to fail, and they both knew it. "When do we deploy?" she asked, keeping her voice level. 72 hours, Hutchins said. "I suggest you use that time to prepare your team, assuming you think you can handle it." He walked away before she could respond, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow. Kira stood alone, the folder cold against her gloved hands, and felt the weight of what he was really asking. This was not about training. This was about proving something, though she was not entirely sure what. Her competence, her father's legacy. Her right to teach methods that did not fit the colonel's view of how soldiers should survive. She looked back at her trainees, watching them struggle with the shelter construction. Most of them would never need this skill, but the ones who did would remember this moment, this lesson, and it might keep them breathing when everything else failed. That was what her father had taught her. Not comfort, not sentiment, just the stubborn refusal to let the wilderness win. A soft whine pulled her attention downward. The stray dog that lived near the training grounds sat beside her boot, its ribs visible through matted fur. She had been feeding it for 3 weeks now, sneaking scraps from the dining facility despite regulations against it. The dog looked up at her with eyes that held neither judgment nor expectation, just simple presence. Kira reached in her pocket and pulled out the protein bar she had saved for breakfast. She unwrapped it carefully and broke off half, offering it to the dog. The animal took it gently, without the desperate snapping of a creature that had forgotten trust. She had earned that trust, one small kindness at a time, the same way her father had earned the trust of the wilderness he had spent his life studying. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed the raw power of nature where you are from, or maybe you know someone who survived against impossible odds. The dog finished eating and pressed against her leg for a moment before trotting away toward whatever shelter it had claimed for the coming storm. Kira watched it go, then turned back toward the administrative building. She had 72 hours to assemble a team, plan a 30-day survival mission, and somehow keep 12 soldiers alive in conditions that even experienced wilderness experts avoided. Inside her office, she spread the mission parameters across her desk. The deployment zone was marked in red, a restricted area 150 miles north of the base, deep in the Brooks Range. She recognized the coordinates immediately. Her father had worked in that region for years before joining the Army, back when he was still a wilderness guide. He had told her stories about those mountains, about the wolf packs that moved through the valleys like gray shadows, about the delicate balance between predator and prey that kept the ecosystem functioning. She opened her bottom desk drawer and pulled out the item she kept hidden there. Her father's old compass. The brass was tarnished, the glass face scratched from decades of use, but the needle still pointed true north with absolute reliability. Beside it lay his field journal, the leather cover worn soft from countless seasons of use. She had read it cover to cover a dozen times since his death, searching for something she could not quite name. Understanding, maybe, or permission to forge her own path while still honoring his. She opened the journal to a random page. Her father's handwriting was precise, methodical, each observation recorded with scientific detachment. But there were moments where emotion bled through. Notes about the intelligence of ravens, sketches of wolf tracks, and repeatedly, references to something he called the agreement, a philosophy about coexistence rather than dominance, about respecting the wilderness as a partner rather than an enemy to be conquered. Colonel Hutchins considered that philosophy weakness. Kira was about to find out if he was right. The memory came unbidden as Kira reviewed the team roster. She was 7 years old, standing beside her father in waist-deep snow, her mittened hand tucked into his gloved one. They had been tracking a caribou herd for 3 days, not to hunt, but to observe, to understand the patterns that govern survival in the Arctic wilderness. Her father had stopped suddenly, his body going perfectly still. Kira had learned to read that stillness. It meant something important was happening, something that required absolute attention. He pointed toward a ridge 200 yards away. There, silhouetted against the winter sky, stood a wolf. Even at that distance, she could see the amber gleam of its eyes. Remember this moment? Her father had whispered, "That wolf knows we are here. It could run. It could attack. Instead, it is choosing to simply exist in the same space as us." That is respect, Kira. Not fear, not aggression, just mutual acknowledgement that we both belong here. The wolf had watched them for perhaps 30 seconds before turning and disappearing over the ridge. Her father had knelt in the snow beside her, his face level with hers. "Someday you will have to choose," he had said. "You can approach the world like a conqueror, taking what you need and destroying what resists. Or you can approach it like a guest, asking permission and showing gratitude. Both methods work, but only one lets you sleep at night." A knock on her office door pulled Kira back to the present. "Come in," she called, closing her father's journal and sliding it back into the drawer. The soldier who entered was young, perhaps 22, with the nervous energy of someone who had not yet learned to hide their anxiety. His name, Tape Red Reyes. He stood at attention, shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. At ease, Corporal Kira said, "What can I do for you?" Corporal Mateo Reyes relaxed fractionally. "I heard about the deployment, Staff Sergeant. The 30-day survival exercise. I wanted to volunteer for the team." Kira studied him. She had noticed Reyes during training exercises. He was competent but hesitant, the kind of soldier who second-guessed every decision because he was terrified of making mistakes. "You know this is not going to be a standard training mission," she said. "The conditions will be extreme. The margin for error is non-existent." "I know," Reyes said. "That is why I want to go. I need to prove I can handle it." There was something in his voice that reminded Kira of herself at that age. The desperate need to demonstrate worth. The fear that everyone saw through whatever facade of confidence you managed to construct. "Prove it to who?" she asked. Reyes hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "To myself, mostly. I grew up in Phoenix, Staff Sergeant. Hottest place in the country. I joined the Army to get out, to become someone different than the kid who could not afford college. But every time I am in the field, I feel like I am faking it. Like everyone can tell I do not really belong here." Kira felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She understood that feeling more than he could know. Being the daughter of a legend meant constantly wondering if her achievements were her own or just echoes of her father's reputation. "You are on the team," she said. "Report to the supply depot at 0600 tomorrow. We have 2 days to prepare, and I need every one of them." The relief that flooded Reyes' face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I will not let you down." After he left, Kira returned to the roster. She made careful notations beside each name, calculating the team's strengths and weaknesses. They would need 2 experienced cold-weather soldiers to anchor the group, 3 medics in case of injury, someone who understood navigation in whiteout conditions, someone who could keep morale up when exhaustion and cold made everyone want to quit. She was reaching for her phone to call the personnel office when it rang. The caller ID showed an internal extension she did not recognize. "Staff Sergeant Vance," she answered. The voice on the other end was clipped and efficient. "This is Captain Morris from Logistics. I have a message from Colonel Hutchins regarding your supply requisition for the November exercise." Kira had not submitted a supply requisition yet. "Go ahead," she said carefully. "The Colonel has pre-approved your equipment list with some modifications. You will be issued standard cold weather gear, rations for 32 days to account for emergency extension, and basic communication equipment. However, he has specified that GPS units will be limited to 2 devices for the entire team. He believes excessive reliance on technology undermines the survival training objectives. 2 GPS units for 12 soldiers traversing 150 miles of unmarked wilderness. It was not just difficult, it was actively dangerous. Kira kept her voice neutral. "I will need to discuss that modification with the Colonel directly." The Colonel anticipated that response, Captain Morris said, and there was something like sympathy in his tone. "He instructed me to remind you that this is a training exercise designed to simulate worst-case scenarios. In real combat, soldiers do not always have optimal equipment. They adapt or they fail." "Understood," Kira said. "Anything else?" "One more item. Your most experienced cold weather specialist, Sergeant First Class Chun, has been reassigned to a different training cycle. He will not be available for your mission. You will need to select a replacement." Kira closed her eyes. Chun had spent 6 years in Alaska. He knew the terrain, understood the dangers, and could teach the inexperienced soldiers the subtle skills that meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. Losing him was not a setback. It was sabotage. "When was this decision made?" she asked. "This morning," the captain replied. "I apologize, Staff Sergeant. I know this complicates your planning." After the call ended, Kira sat in silence, her father's compass resting in her palm. The brass was warm from her body heat. The needle pointed steadily north, indifferent to the complications of human politics and power games. Her father had navigated by this compass for 40 years, through storms and darkness, and it had never once failed him. She thought about the wolf on the ridge, the choice her father had described. Conqueror or guest. Colonel Hutchins operated like a conqueror, using his rank and authority to control outcomes, to prove his dominance. He was testing her, pushing her toward failure, waiting for her to break or quit or make a mistake he could use to justify his belief that her methods were flawed. But her father had taught her another way. You do not fight the wilderness, he had told her countless times. You do not conquer it. You learn its rhythms. You respect its power. You find a path that already exists rather than trying to force a new one. Kira opened her laptop and began revising her team composition. If she could not have Chun, she would build the team differently. More redundancy, more cross-training. She would spend the next 2 days teaching them every lesson her father had ever shared, condensing 40 years of wilderness wisdom into 48 hours of intensive preparation. Outside her window, the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall. By morning, the base would be covered in fresh white, and the temperature would drop another 15 degrees. It was nature's reminder that the clock was always ticking, that comfort was temporary, and that survival was earned through preparation and respect, not demanded through force. The helicopter's rotors carved through frozen air as it carried Kira's team deeper into the Brooks Range. Below them, the landscape stretched in endless variations of white and gray, broken only by the skeletal fingers of black spruce forests and the jagged teeth of exposed ridgelines. Kira watched through the window as civilization disappeared behind them, swallowed by the immensity of wilderness that had no interest in human ambitions or conflicts. Beside her, Corporal Reyes gripped his equipment bag with white knuckles. His face had gone pale, though whether from altitude or anxiety, Kira could not tell. She leaned close enough for him to hear over the engine noise. "First time in a Chinook?" she asked. "First time this far from anything that looks like help," he admitted. "How do you stay calm?" "Practice," Kira said, "an understanding that panic uses more energy than problem solving. Save your fear for when it is useful." Across from them sat Specialist Yuki Nakamura, the team's primary medic. She was reviewing her supplies with methodical precision, checking and rechecking inventory despite having done the same thing twice before boarding. Kira had specifically requested Nakamura. The woman had spent 2 years stationed in Greenland and understood cold weather injuries in ways that textbook training could never teach. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 5 minutes to drop zone, Staff Sergeant. Weather window is closing faster than forecast. We will need to extract immediately after you disembark." Kira acknowledged and signaled the team to prepare. 12 soldiers moved with varying degrees of efficiency, checking straps and securing equipment. She had spent the last 48 hours drilling them relentlessly, condensing wilderness survival into an intensive crash course that left everyone exhausted before the mission even began. But exhaustion was better than ignorance. Tired soldiers could rest. Dead ones could not learn. The helicopter descended toward a clearing that was barely large enough to accommodate it. Snow swirled in violent eddies as the rotors disrupted the air, creating a whiteout that obscured everything beyond 10 feet. Kira felt the skids touch ground and immediately began moving, urging her team out into the maelstrom. Equipment bags hit the snow. Soldiers stumbled in the rotor wash. Within 90 seconds, all 12 were clear. The helicopter lifted immediately, its departure creating a sudden silence that felt almost threatening. The engine noise faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through spruce needles and the creaking complaint of trees bending under ice. Kira's team stood in a rough circle, their faces registering the reality of their situation. They were alone, truly, completely alone, in a place where mistakes were measured in body temperature and survival time. "First priority is shelter," Kira announced. "We have maybe 3 hours before the next weather system hits. Reyes, Nakamura, you are with me on the command post. Davidson and Kowalski, start scouting for suitable sites within 200 meters. Everyone else, begin gear organization. Nothing touches the ground without being secured. If it blows away out here, it is gone forever." The team dispersed with reasonable efficiency. Kira allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They were green, but they were listening. That counted for something. She pulled out the map and compass, confirming their position. The GPS units that Colonel Hutchins had so generously limited were still packed, reserved for genuine emergencies. Kira preferred traditional navigation anyway. Technology failed. Batteries died. But a compass and the ability to read terrain were reliable in ways that electronics could never match. According to her calculations, they were approximately 8 miles north of where the mission parameters had specified. Not a huge discrepancy, but enough to matter. She made a note to verify with the GPS once they established base camp. If their starting coordinates were wrong, everything downstream would be compromised. Movement at the tree line caught her attention. For a moment, she thought it was one of the scouts returning early. Then she saw the shape more clearly, low to the ground, moving with liquid grace through the snow. A wolf. The animal paused at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 60 yards away. Even at that distance, Kira could see the intelligence in its posture, the careful assessment of these new arrivals in its territory. Other shapes materialized from the forest. 2 more wolves, then a fourth. A hunting party, or perhaps advanced scouts for a larger pack. Nakamura had frozen beside her. Staff Sergeant, she whispered. Stay calm, Kira said quietly. They're just curious. We are new in their space. They're trying to understand what we represent. Threat or opportunity or just another feature of the landscape. The lead wolf took 3 steps closer. Its coat was darker than the others, almost charcoal against the snow. But its eyes caught the diffused sunlight filtering through clouds. And for one impossible moment, Kira felt a shock of recognition so profound it stopped her breath. Those eyes, that particular shade of amber. She had seen them before, decades ago, when her father had made a choice that seemed insane to everyone except him. It could not be the same animal. Wolves live perhaps 12 years in the wild. 15 at most. 35 years was impossible. It's something in the way the animal held itself, in the tilt of its head as it studied her, triggered memories she had not consciously accessed in years. Her father kneeling beside her in the snow, the wolf on the ridge, the lesson about respect and coexistence. The moment stretched, suspended in the crystalline cold. Then the wolf turned, a fluid motion that was more like water than flesh, and disappeared back into the forest. The others followed, gray shadows melting into gray trees, until Kira could not tell where the pack ended and the wilderness began. Nakamura released a breath she had been holding. That was intense, she said. I have never seen wolves behave like that. They usually avoid humans completely. My father used to say that wolves are the best teachers in the wilderness, Kira replied. They never waste energy on unnecessary conflict. They assess, they adapt, they move on. We should do the same. By the time Davidson and Kowalski returned with their site recommendations, Kira had pushed the wolf encounter to the back of her mind. There were immediate priorities: shelter construction, gear organization, establishing patrol rotations, and emergency protocols. The team worked steadily through the afternoon, and Kira was pleased to see them applying the lessons from her crash course. They were slow, but they were thorough. Speed would come with practice. Thoroughness had to be built into habit from the beginning. As the sun began its early northern descent toward the horizon, Kira called the team together. They gathered in the command post shelter, a structure built from spruce poles and insulated with packed snow, exactly as she had demonstrated during training. 12 faces watched her, illuminated by the glow of a single LED lantern. We are starting 8 miles north of our planned position, she told them. I verified with GPS someone made an error with our drop coordinates. It does not change our mission parameters, but it does mean our extraction point is further than anticipated. We will adjust our supply consumption accordingly. She did not mention her suspicion that the coordinate error was not accidental. No point in undermining morale with conspiracy theories, even if they happen to be true. The team needed to focus on survival, not politics. One other item, she continued. We are not alone out here. There's at least one wolf pack in the immediate area. You will treat them with respect. No aggressive behavior. No feeding attempts. We are guests in their home. Act accordingly. The briefing concluded. Kira assigned watch rotations and dismissed everyone to their shelters. Alone in the command post, she pulled out her father's journal and turned to a page she had marked weeks ago. His handwriting described an encounter with a wolf pack in this same region, 36 years earlier. He had written about the pack's dynamics, their hunting patterns, their territory boundaries. And he had written about the leader, a dark-coated male with amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any wild animal should. Outside, the wind picked up, the temperature dropped, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their small circle of human warmth, wolves moved through their ancient patterns, following rules that predated human arrival by millennia. The communication equipment failed on day 4. Kira had been conducting a routine check-in with base when the radio emitted a sharp pop, followed by the acrid smell of burning circuitry. She examined the unit carefully, her gloved fingers tracing the damage. The failure was not catastrophic equipment malfunction. Someone had installed a component with the wrong voltage rating. It would work perfectly for 72 hours, then burn itself out exactly as it had just done. Nakamura looked over her shoulder at the dead radio. "Can you repair it?" she asked. Kira shook her head. "Not without parts we do not have. We still have the emergency beacon, but that is for life-threatening situations only. We are officially isolated until the scheduled extraction in 26 days." She did not voice her growing certainty that the radio failure was intentional. Colonel Hutchins had arranged this mission, modified the equipment list, changed the coordinates, and removed her most experienced team member. Each decision by itself could be explained as reasonable training protocol. Together, they formed a pattern of deliberate sabotage. The question was why? What did Hutchins gain by ensuring her failure? Was it simple vindictiveness, or was there something larger at play? Her father's journal had mentioned restricted areas in this region, zones where military and civilian access was prohibited for reasons never fully explained. Perhaps Hutchins did not want her asking questions about what lay in the wilderness her father had spent years documenting. Specialist Davidson approached the command post, his face tight with concern. "Staff Sergeant, we have a situation. The cache we buried yesterday for the return route. Someone went to verify the GPS coordinates, and the unit is not responding. We tried the second GPS, same problem. Both units are dead." Kira felt ice settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Show me." Both GPS units had suffered identical failures. The screen would power on, display the startup sequence, then freeze. No amount of troubleshooting could revive them. Kira had seen this type of failure before, during her deployment in Afghanistan. It happened when someone installed corrupted firmware that would activate on a timer, rendering the device useless. "We navigate by map and compass from here," she announced to the assembled team. Old school, the way soldiers traveled for centuries before satellites. Her voice carried confidence she did not entirely feel. Losing GPS was manageable. Losing GPS and radio communication simultaneously meant they were truly on their own. That night, the first major storm hit. Wind screamed through the mountain passes, driving snow horizontally with enough force to scour exposed skin. The team huddled in their shelters while Kira monitored conditions, calculating how long their supplies would last if the storm pinned them down for days instead of hours. Around midnight, during her watch rotation, she heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was mechanical, distant but unmistakable. A helicopter. She grabbed her emergency signal mirror and rushed outside, but the snow was too thick. She could not see 20 feet, let alone locate an aircraft. The sound circled their position once, twice, then faded toward the south. Someone was out there, flying in conditions that should have grounded all aircraft. Either it was an emergency rescue operation, or someone was checking to confirm that Kira's team was exactly where they were supposed to be. But if it was rescue, why not attempt contact? Why not land? She returned to the command post and tried the radio one more time, hoping against logic that it might revive. Instead, she caught a fragment of transmission. The signal was weak, broken by static, but she recognized Colonel Hutchins' voice. Confirmed visual, he was saying, "Team, is in position. Weather should keep them isolated for the duration. No complications anticipative. The transmission cut out. Kira sat in the darkness, her mind racing through implications. Hutchins was not monitoring their mission from base. He was out here, flying reconnaissance, ensuring his sabotage remained effective. The question of why had just become far more urgent. Morning brought clearer skies, but no clarity on their situation. The storm had dumped 3 feet of fresh snow, transforming the landscape into a uniform white that obliterated familiar landmarks. Kira gathered the team and explained their new reality without revealing her suspicions about deliberate interference. "We are going to treat this as a true survival scenario," she told them. "No outside communication. No electronic navigation. We rely on skills, teamwork, and the knowledge we carry in our heads. This is exactly the kind of situation your training was designed for." Corporal Reyes raised his hand hesitantly. "Staff Sergeant, how do we know when extraction is coming if we cannot communicate?" "We maintain our timeline," Kira said. 26 days from now, we are at the designated extraction point. Until then, we survive, we learn, and we adapt." "Questions?" Specialist Kowalski spoke up. "What about the wolves? I saw tracks around the perimeter this morning. Fresh ones. They're getting closer." Kira had seen the tracks too. Multiple animals, circling the camp in patterns that suggested reconnaissance rather than hunting. The pack was monitoring them, learning their routines, assessing whether these humans represented danger or opportunity. "Let them watch," she said. "We are not their natural prey, and they are smart enough to know it. As long as we respect their space and maintain our defensive protocols, they will keep their distance." But even as she spoke, Kira wondered if that was entirely true. The amber-eyed wolf from the first day had appeared twice more, always at the edges of visibility, always watching. There was something deliberate in its behavior that went beyond normal predator caution. It was as if the animal was waiting for something, though Kira could not imagine what. Over the next 3 days, the team settled into routines. Morning patrol to check the perimeter. Midday training on various survival skills. Evening equipment maintenance and meal preparation. Kira rotated responsibilities, so everyone gained experience in every role. She watched Reyes grow more confident as he mastered tasks that had terrified him initially. She saw Nakamura emerge as a natural teacher, patient and thorough when explaining medical procedures to soldiers who might someday need to save their own lives. The isolation should have felt oppressive, but instead it created a strange intimacy. Without the distractions of modern technology, the team began actually talking to each other. Stories emerged around the evening fire. Reyes shared his journey from Phoenix poverty to military service, his voice carrying a mix of pride and residual shame about where he came from. Nakamura described growing up in a military family that moved every 2 years, never putting down roots, never quite belonging anywhere. Kira found herself sharing memories of her father too. Not the legend that everyone knew, but the man who had taught her to read animal tracks before she could read words, who had shown her that survival was not about dominating nature, but understanding it well enough to move through it without leaving scars. On the 7th night, the wolves came closer than before. Kira woke to find the amber-eyed leader standing at the edge of the firelight, perfectly still. The other team members slept on, exhausted from the day's exertions. It was just Kira and the wolf, separated by perhaps 30 feet and 35 years of impossible time. She should have woken the others. Protocol demanded it. Instead, she remained motionless, watching the animal that should not exist. The wolf tilted its head, and in that gesture Kira saw an echo of the creature her father had spared. The same curiosity, the same absence of fear or aggression, just presence and perhaps impossibly recognition. Then voices carried on the wind from somewhere beyond their camp. Human voices, speaking in tones too low to make out words. The wolf's ears swiveled toward the sound. It looked back at Kira one more time, and she could have sworn she saw something like warning in those ancient eyes. Then it was gone, vanishing into darkness with the silence of falling snow. The scream shattered the pre-dawn silence. Kira was moving before conscious thought registered, her hand finding the knife at her belt as she burst from the command post. The temperature had dropped to 30 below during the night, and the shock of cold air felt like inhaling broken glass. Specialist Davidson lay 20 feet from his shelter, his leg twisted at an angle that made Kira's stomach clench. He had been heading to relieve the watch when he stepped on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow. The fall had driven his knee sideways with enough force that, even from a distance, Kira could see the wrongness of the joint. Nakamura was already there, her medic training overriding the panic that showed in her eyes. "Do not move," she commanded Davidson. "Staff Sergeant, I need the medical kit. Now." Kira sprinted back to retrieve the supplies, while other team members emerged from their shelters, drawn by the commotion. By the time she returned, Nakamura had cut away Davidson's thermal pants to expose the injury. The knee was massively swollen, already turning purple. When Nakamura tried to assess the damage, Davidson's scream echoed across the frozen landscape. "It is dislocated," Nakamura said quietly. "Possibly torn ligaments. Maybe a fracture. I cannot tell without imaging equipment." She looked up at Kira, and the fear in her expression was carefully controlled but absolutely present. "He needs surgical intervention, real medical care, not field medicine." Kira's mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as it formed. They were 10 days into the mission, 16 days from scheduled extraction. The emergency beacon would bring rescue, but using it meant mission failure, career consequences, and confirmation of everything Colonel Hutchins believed about her inadequate training philosophy. More importantly, it meant Davidson would be medevaced while the rest of the team remained behind, potentially facing whatever mysterious presence she had detected in the wilderness. But none of that mattered if Davidson lost his leg to complications. "Staff Sergeant," Nakamura said, her voice dropping even lower. "If this is a complete ACL tear with arterial involvement, he could develop compartment syndrome within hours. In this cold, with limited circulation, the tissue death timeline accelerates. We're talking about permanent damage or amputation if we wait too long." The weight of command settled on Kira's shoulders like the snow that continued to fall. 13 lives depending on her decision. One soldier in immediate danger. No communication with higher command. No way to verify whether help would even come if she activated the beacon. She knelt beside Davidson. His face was gray, slick with sweat despite the brutal cold. "How bad is the pain?" she asked. 11 out of 10, he gasped. "But I can handle it, Staff Sergeant. Do not abort the mission because of me." Kira appreciated the sentiment even as she recognized its foolishness. "Nakamura, stabilize him as best you can. I need to check something." She returned to the command post and pulled out the map, studying it with new urgency. Their current position was marked in red. The scheduled extraction point was marked in blue, 138 miles to the south. But there was another notation on the map, something she had noticed before but dismissed as irrelevant. A small black triangle approximately 40 miles to the northeast. Military installations were marked with squares. Civilian settlements with circles. Triangles indicated restricted zones, areas where access was prohibited without special authorization. Her father's journal had mentioned a restricted zone in this region. He had called it the Sanctuary, a place where the wolf packs denayed and raised their young, protected from hunters and trappers by military decree. The restriction had been established in the 1980s, ostensibly for ecological research purposes. But her father's notes suggested something more complex, some kind of unofficial agreement between the military and the wilderness itself. If the sanctuary was real, if it was where her father's notes indicated, then it represented a possibility. Not rescue, but perhaps resources, shelter, supplies, maybe even communication equipment if the site had been maintained. It was also 40 miles of brutal terrain away from their planned route. 40 miles that would consume supplies and energy they could not spare. 40 miles that might lead to nothing but another abandoned facility in an endless wilderness. Kira returned to where Nakamura was splinting Davidson's leg using improvised materials. "How long can you keep him stable?" she asked. Nakamura did not hesitate. With proper immobilization, pain management, and monitoring for complications, maybe 72 hours. After that, the risk factors start compounding exponentially. 72 hours. 3 days to reach the sanctuary, confirm whether it offered any resources, and return if it did not. 3 days to gamble on information from a journal written by a dead man who might have been recording fantasies rather than facts. She gathered the team, excluding Davidson, who was drifting in and out of consciousness as the pain medication took effect. They stood in a tight circle, their breath creating clouds of condensation that merged and dissipated in the frigid air. "We have a decision to make," Kira began. She explained the situation without softening the brutal mathematics of survival. Davidson needed help they could not provide with current resources. The emergency beacon might bring rescue, but there were no guarantees of response time in this weather. The alternative was a forced march to a location that might not even exist. Corporal Reyes spoke first. "What would your father do?" he asked. Not as criticism, but genuine question. Kira thought about that. Her father would have prevented the injury through better protocols. He would have anticipated every danger and planned accordingly. But she was not her father, and this situation existed regardless of what might have been. "My father taught me that the wilderness does not care about your plans," she said. "It only cares about your adaptability. Right now, waiting means watching Davidson deteriorate. Moving means risk, but also possibility." The team voted unanimously to attempt the sanctuary. Kira divided them into 2 groups. 6 soldiers would remain at base camp with Davidson, maintaining the shelters and preserving supplies. 6 would make the forced march northeast, traveling light and fast. Nakamura would stay behind to monitor Davidson's condition. Reyes would come with Kira, along with their 4 strongest cold weather specialists. They departed at first light, each carrying minimal gear to maximize speed. The terrain was unforgiving. Wind-scoured ridges alternated with deep snow drifts that swallowed legs to the hip. The temperature hovered around -20, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. They moved in single file, taking turns breaking trail, conserving energy through rotation and discipline. On the second day, Kieran noticed the wolves. Not just glimpses at the periphery, but deliberate paralleling. The pack moved through the forest alongside their route, maintaining consistent distance, neither approaching nor retreating. It was escort behavior, though whether protective or predatory remained unclear. The amber-eyed leader appeared on a ridgeline as the sun reached its brief zenith. Kira stopped, causing the line behind her to halt. The wolf sat perfectly still against the sky, its dark coat stark against the white background. Then it stood, turned, and began walking northeast. After 20 paces it stopped and looked back at them. "Is that wolf leading us?" Reyes asked, his voice carrying disbelief and wonder in equal measure. Kira thought about her father's notes, the agreement he had written about, the respect between species that transcended the typical predator-prey dynamic. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." They followed the wolf through terrain that would have been impassable without guidance. The animal led them around hidden crevasses, through passages that offered shelter from wind, past areas where the snow concealed treacherous ice. It never came close enough to touch, but it never let them lose sight of it either. On the third day, as Nakamura's 72-hour deadline approached, they crested a ridge and saw it. A cluster of buildings nestled in a valley, partially buried in snow, but unmistakably human construction. The sanctuary existed. The wolf had brought them exactly where they needed to be. The buildings were older than Kira had expected. Not modern military construction, but structures from another era, their logs weathered silver by decades of exposure. Snow had drifted against the walls, creating organic sculptures that softened the hard geometry of human architecture. But what stopped her breath was not the buildings themselves. It was the wolf. The amber-eyed leader sat directly in front of the largest structure, perfectly centered on the entrance path, as if waiting. As Kira's team descended into the valley, the wolf did not move. It simply watched, And in that patient observation, Kira felt the weight of something far larger than a simple animal encounter. When they were perhaps 50 feet away, the wolf stood. It took 3 deliberate steps backward, then turned and walked into the forest. Before disappearing completely, it looked back one final time. The gesture felt unmistakably like farewell, or perhaps completion of some task it had been bound to fulfill. Reyes stood beside Kira, his face showing the exhaustion of 3 days of brutal travel. "Did that just happen?" he asked. "Or am I hallucinating from hypothermia?" "It happened," Kira confirmed. She moved toward the main building, her hand instinctively checking her weapon even though she sensed no threat. The door was not locked. It opened with a groan of frozen hinges, revealing an interior that was impossibly preserved. A wood stove sat cold but ready. Shelves held supplies in military-grade storage containers. Emergency rations, medical equipment, communication gear that looked decades old but meticulously maintained. And on a rough-hewn desk against the far wall, covered in a thin layer of dust, sat a leathered journal identical to the one Kira carried in her pack. She approached it slowly, her gloved fingers trembling as she opened the cover. The handwriting was her father's, but these were not entries she had seen before. This was a different record entirely, a continuation of the journal she knew, picking up where the other had ended. The first entry was dated 3 days before her father's death. "If you are reading this, Kira," the entry began, "then the wolf has done what I asked. I knew someday you would need this place, just as I knew that you would not believe me if I simply told you about it. Some truths require experience rather than explanation." Her throat tightened. She forced herself to keep reading. 35 years ago, I made a choice that everyone said was foolish. A wolf had wandered into our camp, likely desperate from hunger or injured. I had a clear shot. Every protocol said to eliminate the potential threat. Instead, I lowered my rifle. I saw something in that animal's eyes that I recognized. Not human intelligence, but consciousness, awareness, the kind of deep knowing that exists beyond language. The wolf did not attack. It did not run. It simply stood there, and in that moment, I understood that respect is not something we grant from a position of superiority. It is something we exchange with those we recognize as equals in their own domain. I spent the next 3 decades studying that wolf pack. They allowed me into their world in ways that science cannot explain. They showed me denning sites, hunting grounds, the intricate social dynamics that kept their family functioning across generations. And yes, Kira, it is the same wolf. I do not understand how it is possible. Biology says it should not be. But I have watched that animal for 35 years, and it has not aged the way nature says it should. Kira looked up from the journal, her mind struggling to process what she was reading. Around her, the team was exploring the facility, discovering supplies that could save Davidson's life. But she remained frozen, caught between rational thought and impossible truth. She continued reading. "This sanctuary was built in 1987 after I convinced certain military officials that this region needed protection. I did not tell them about the wolf. I told them about ecological research and unique wildlife populations. They granted the restriction because it served their purposes. What those purposes were, I never fully learned. But I have always suspected this area holds significance beyond what official records acknowledge. I have maintained this facility for 30 years, stocked it with supplies, kept the equipment functional, all in preparation for a day I knew would come, the day when you would need refuge. When the wilderness would test you, as it has tested every member of our family who chose to truly see it rather than simply use it. Colonel Hutchins knows about this place. He was with me when I first encountered the wolf pack. He wanted to hunt them, trophy kills to mount on office walls. I refused to reveal the locations. He has hated me for that refusal ever since. When I died, that hatred transferred to you. The entry continued, but Kira had to stop. Her father had known. He had known that Hutchins would target her, had known that she would face impossible choices, had prepared this sanctuary as insurance against exactly the scenario she now found herself in. "Staff Sergeant, One of the specialists called. We found a radio. It is old, but it looks operational. Kira closed the journal carefully and joined her team. The radio was indeed functional. A backup system that ran on batteries her father had apparently replaced regularly until his death 3 years ago. She powered it on, adjusted the frequency to the emergency channel, and tried to raise base. Static answered. Then, faintly, a voice. This is Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson. Identify yourself. This is Staff Sergeant Kira Vance. November training exercise. We have a medical emergency requiring immediate evacuation. One soldier with severe knee injury. Current position is approximately 40 miles northeast of our last known coordinates. There was a pause. Then a different voice came through. One she recognized. This is Colonel Hutchins. Staff Sergeant Vance, your current position is in a restricted area. You are not authorized to be there. Sir, we have a critically injured soldier, Kira responded, keeping her voice level. Authorization is secondary to life safety. Your radio communications went dark 10 days ago, Hutchins said. We assumed equipment failure. How did you access restricted facility communications? We followed a wolf pack to an old research station, Kira replied. The station has emergency supplies and working radio equipment. We need immediate medical evacuation for Specialist Davidson. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, she heard other voices arguing. Then Hutchins again. Negative on evacuation. Weather conditions prohibit flight operations in that sector. You'll have to stabilize the soldier and proceed to original extraction point on schedule. Kira felt cold rage settle in her chest. Sir, this soldier will lose his leg if he does not receive proper medical care within the next 24 hours. That is unfortunate, Hutchins said. But I cannot authorize flight operations into restricted airspace for a training exercise injury. You made the decision to enter unauthorized territory. You will have to deal with the consequences. The radio went dead. Kira tried multiple frequencies. Nothing. Hutchins had cut them off, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this had been his plan all along. Get her team into trouble. Ensure she made desperate decisions. Then use those decisions to justify ending her career and discrediting everything her father had taught. Reyes stood beside her, his face reflecting the horror she felt. He is going to let Davidson die to prove a point, he said quietly. No, quiere replay. He's going to try, but he does not know what else we found here. She returned to her father's journal and read the final entry. The sanctuary has everything you need. Medical supplies to stabilize injuries. Emergency beacon with direct satellite uplink that bypasses standard military channels. Coordinates to an alternate extraction point where civilian rescue services can reach you. Hutchins does not control everything, Kira. He never did. Use what I have given you. Save your team. And remember that the wilderness is not your enemy. It is your ally if you approach it with respect instead of fear. The wolf proved that to me 35 years ago. Today, it proved it to you. Your father always. Kira found the emergency beacon exactly where the journal indicated. It was a civilian unit, registered to her father personally, with direct connection to Alaska State Rescue Services. She activated it and transmitted their coordinates along with Davidson's medical status. The response came within minutes. This is Alaska Rescue 7. We have your position. Weather is marginal but flyable. Estimate arrival your location in 90 minutes. Prepare landing zone for helicopter extraction. The team mobilized immediately. While they cleared a landing area, Kira stood at the window watching the forest. The wolf pack was visible now, sitting in a semicircle at the tree line. The amber-eyed leader sat at the center, and for a moment, Kira could have sworn it nodded. Understanding settled over her like snowfall. Her father had not just built a sanctuary for wolves. He had built a bridge between species, founded on mutual respect and recognition. And somehow, impossibly, that bridge had held for 35 years, waiting for the moment when it would save his daughter's life. The helicopter from Alaska Rescue 7 touched down precisely 90 minutes after Kira's transmission. 2 paramedics emerged, moving with practiced efficiency through the snow. They had Davidson loaded and stabilized within 12 minutes. Their professionalism a stark contrast to Colonel Hutchins' calculated abandonment. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 50s with weathered features that spoke of decades in Alaskan wilderness, paused before boarding. "You are incredibly lucky we could reach you," she said. "Another hour and the weather window would have closed completely. What were you doing this far into restricted territory?" "Following a wolf," Kira replied, and watched the woman's expression shift from professional concern to something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. The paramedic glanced toward the treeline where the pack still sat watching. "Your father used to say the same thing," she said quietly. "James Vance. I flew search and rescue with him for 15 years before he joined the Army. He claimed the wolves in this region understood things they should not. Most of us thought he was half crazy." She looked back at Kira. "I'm starting to think he was the only sane one among us." The helicopter lifted off, taking Davidson toward proper medical care and leaving Kira's reduced team standing in the sanctuary valley. 6 soldiers remained at base camp with the supplies. 6 stood here with her, having witnessed something that would reshape their understanding of wilderness survival. The question now was what to do with the 13 days remaining until scheduled extraction. Kira gathered her team inside the main building. They sat around the coldwood stove while she lit a fire using supplies her father had left behind. The flames caught quickly, filling the space with warmth and dancing light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. "We have a choice," she began. "We can return to base camp, consolidate the team, and continue the original training mission. Or we can use this opportunity to learn something most soldiers never get the chance to understand. This sanctuary represents 30 years of my father's research. His observations about coexistence with the wilderness instead of domination over it. If we stay here for the remaining time, we can study his methods directly." Reyes spoke first. "With respect, Staff Sergeant, how do we explain this to Colonel Hutchins? We are in restricted territory. We used unauthorized communication equipment. We called civilian rescue instead of military channels. He is going to crucify us." "Probably," Kira agreed. "But he was already planning to do that regardless of our choices. He sabotaged our equipment. He refused medical evacuation. He has been engineering our failure from the beginning. The question is whether we let his agenda define our actions or whether we accomplish something meaningful despite his interference." One of the specialists, a quiet soldier named Chun who rarely spoke, raised his hand. "What exactly did your father discover here, Staff Sergeant? That wolf leading us, that was not normal animal behavior. And the way it looked at you, like it knew you, that goes beyond wildlife biology." Kira pulled out both journals, the one she had carried and the one she had found. She opened them side by side, showing the team entries that described encounters spanning decades. "My father believed that certain animals, particularly wolves in this region, possessed a form of consciousness that we do not fully understand. Not human intelligence, but something equally valid in its own context. He spent 30 years building trust with that pack, demonstrating through consistent action that humans could be partners rather than threats." She turned to an entry from 1992. It described a winter when her father had discovered 3 wolf pups orphaned after their mother was killed by illegal hunters. Against all wilderness protocols, he had fed them until they were old enough to join another pack. One of those pups had a distinctive dark coat and amber eyes. "That pup is now the adult wolf that led us here," Kira said. "Biologically impossible, but I watched that animal for 3 days. It is the same wolf my father described. The same one I saw when I was 5 years old, the day he chose to lower his rifle instead of taking a trophy kill." The team absorbed this in silence. Finally, Chun spoke again. "So what are we really protecting here, Staff Sergeant? Is this just about wolves, or is there something else in this restricted zone?" Kira had wondered the same thing. Her father's later journal entries hinted at discoveries he never fully explained. References to unusual magnetic readings. Notes about aurora activity that did not match typical patterns. Observations that the wolf pack seemed to avoid certain areas within the sanctuary boundaries, as if responding to something humans could not detect. "I do not know," she admitted. But I think my father was protecting more than just a wolf pack. I think he found something in this wilderness that challenged conventional understanding. Something that Colonel Hutchins either wants to exploit or wants to keep hidden. Maybe both. That night, Kira read through her father's journals with new focus, searching for patterns in his observations. The entries became more cryptic in his final year. He wrote about debts and obligations, about promises that transcended human lifespans, about the weight of knowledge that could not be shared because no one would believe it without witnessing it themselves. One entry, dated 2 weeks before his death, struck her with particular force. I am dying, Kira. The doctors confirmed it yesterday. Lung cancer from too many years breathing campfire smoke and cold air. I have maybe 6 months. I'm not afraid of death. I have lived more richly than most men dream of. But I'm afraid of leaving work unfinished. The wolves need protection, not just from hunters, but from those who would study them as specimens rather than respect them as beings. Hutchins has been pressuring me for coordinates. He claims he wants to establish a research program, but I have seen the contracts he is negotiating with private military companies. They want to understand how the pack navigates in conditions where technology fails. They want to weaponize wilderness knowledge. I cannot let that happen. So, I am doing something that will seem insane to anyone who finds this journal. I am asking the wolf for help. The same animal I spared 35 years ago. I am trusting that the bond we built matters beyond my lifetime. If this works, if the wolf remembers and honors what passed between us, then you will be reading this in the sanctuary I built. You will have been led here by an animal that should not exist, but does anyway. And you will have to decide whether to protect what I protected or whether to let it fall into hands that see only utility and profit. I cannot make that choice for you, daughter. I can only give you the information and trust your judgment. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you. Not because you followed my path, but because you had the courage to question it. Kira closed the journal as tears froze on her cheeks. Her father had known he was dying, had known Hutchins would come after her, had arranged everything, including his relationship with an impossible wolf, to give her the tools she would need to survive both the wilderness and the politics that sought to control it. The question was what she would do with those tools. Continue the mission and return to face Hutchins with evidence of his sabotage. Stay in the sanctuary and learn everything her father had discovered. Or find some third path that honored his legacy while forging her own. Outside, the aurora began to dance across the sky, ribbons of green and violet that seemed to pulse with unusual intensity. The wolf pack gathered at the tree-line, their forms silhouetted against the cosmic light show. And Kira understood that her father's choice, made 3.5 decades ago on a frozen hillside, had set in motion events that were still unfolding. Events that would determine not just her future, but the future of a wilderness that held secrets even her father had not fully comprehended. The decision to reunite with the base camp team was made easier by necessity. They needed to retrieve their supplies and brief the others on what they had discovered. But as Kira's group prepared for the return journey on the morning of day 12, the wolves began behaving strangely. The pack circled the sanctuary buildings repeatedly, their movements agitated in ways Kira had never witnessed. The amber-eyed leader stood at the valley entrance, blocking the path south with its body. Something is wrong, Reyes said, watching the animals' pace. They're trying to tell us something. Kira consulted her father's journals for references to unusual wolf behavior. She found an entry from 1998 describing a similar incident. The pack had prevented her father from entering a particular valley, circling him and herding him back until he changed course. 2 hours later, an avalanche had swept through the exact area he had intended to traverse. Her father had written that the wolves could sense geological instability that human instruments missed. If the wolves were warning them now, what danger were they detecting? Kira climbed to high ground and scanned the terrain with binoculars. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, perhaps 3 miles to the south, movement caught her eye. Not wildlife, but icolas. At least 4 of them tracked all-terrain machines designed for deep snow operations. They were heading directly toward the base camp location. She adjusted focus and felt her stomach drop. The vehicles bore no military markings. The personnel moving around them wore tactical gear that was too uniform to be civilian, too generic to be official military. Private contractors. The same kind her father had written about in his final entries. "Get everyone inside," Kira ordered. Now, within minutes her team had withdrawn to the main building. She established watch positions at windows while trying radio. This time she did not call the military frequency. She used the civilian emergency channel her father had programmed into the backup system. "Alaska State Troopers, this is an emergency transmission from Restricted Wilderness Zone Delta 7. We have visual confirmation of unauthorized armed personnel operating in protected territory. Request immediate assistance." The response was immediate, but not from state police. The voice was male, calm, and carried the flat effect of someone accustomed to delivering threats. "This is Apex Security Solutions. You're transmitting on monitored frequencies. Identify yourself." Kira killed the transmission. Apex Security Solutions. She knew that name from her father's research. A private military company that had repeatedly sought contracts for Arctic operations training. They had approached the Army multiple times, always rebuffed because their methods prioritized efficiency over environmental protocols. But if they were operating here now, someone had given them access. "Staff Sergeant," Chun called from the east window. "The base camp. I can see smoke." Kira grabbed the binoculars and trained them on the location where her other 6 soldiers should be waiting. Black smoke rose in a column that was too thick, too sustained to be a control campfire. Either the camp was burning or someone was sending a signal. Neither option was good. The radio crackled to life again without her transmitting. "Staff Sergeant Vance," the same flat voice said. "We know who you are. We know what your father discovered here. And we know you have accessed his research materials. You have 2 options. Surrender those materials to our custody, and we extract you and your team safely. Or we come get them ourselves, and your team becomes unfortunate casualties of a training accident in hostile terrain." Kira's mind raced. Hutchins had not just sabotaged their mission. He had sold them out. Probably arranged the whole scenario to give Apex access to the sanctuary under cover of a military training exercise gone wrong. If she and her team died out here, there would be investigations but no real accountability. Training accidents happened. Hostile Wilderness was unforgiving. The official report would bury the truth along with their bodies. "What exactly does Apex want?" she transmitted. "Your father spent 30 years documenting something remarkable in this region," the voice replied. "An ecosystem that thrives in conditions that should be uninhabitable. Wildlife that navigates by methods our instruments cannot detect. His research could revolutionize Arctic military operations. We are prepared to pay for exclusive access to his data." "My father did not write that research to be weaponized," Kira said. "Your father is dead," the voice replied with casual cruelty. "His intentions died with him. You have 30 minutes to decide. After that, we proceed to your location and take what we need." The transmission ended. Kira turned to her team. 6 soldiers, exhausted from days of brutal survival conditions, now facing trained military contractors who had vehicle support and superior numbers. The tactical situation was hopeless by conventional assessment. But Kira had spent her entire life learning that conventional assessment missed critical variables. She gathered the team in the center of the building. "We're not surrendering anything," she said. "My father protected this place for 30 years. We're going to protect it for 30 more minutes until I figure out how to get us all out of here alive." "Questions?" Reyes raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, 6 of us with small arms against what looks like at least 20 contractors with vehicle support. How exactly do we win that fight?" "We do not fight it," Kira replied. "We survive it. There's a difference." She pulled out her father's journals and found a section on sanctuary defenses. He had been thorough, documenting not just the wolf pack's behavior, but the entire ecosystem's natural advantages. The valley had only 2 viable vehicle approaches, both of which narrowed to choke points where the terrain became treacherous. The forest surrounding the buildings was dense enough to prevent easy movement of armed teams. And the wolves themselves represented a variable that the contractors would not have accounted for. Most importantly, her father had prepared for exactly this scenario. Hidden in the building's foundation was a cache that went beyond emergency supplies. Kira found it where the journal indicated, concealed beneath floorboards that looked identical to all the others. Inside were items that made her understand just how seriously her father had taken the threat of forced appropriation. Flares designed to create light and noise disorientation. Smoke grenades that would work even in extreme cold. Trip lines and noisemakers that could turn the forest into an early warning system. And something else. A detailed map showing passages through the terrain that only someone with decades of wilderness knowledge would recognize. Escape routes that the wolves used, paths too narrow for vehicles, too obscure for anyone without intimate understanding of the land. Her father had not just built a sanctuary. He had built a fortress, using the wilderness itself as fortification. Kira spread the map across the table. "Here is what we're going to do," she began. "We're going to give Apex exactly what they expect. Frightened soldiers, isolated and unprepared, making desperate mistakes. What they're not expecting is that we have been trained by someone who understood that survival is not about superior firepower. It is about superior knowledge of the environment you are operating in." The team listened as she outlined a plan that would have horrified any conventional military tactician. They were going to abandon the buildings, scatter into the forest using the wolf paths her father had mapped, set defensive measures that would slow the contractors' advance and create chaos in their formations. And then, when Apex was committed to searching the sanctuary, they would use the escape routes to circle back and reach the base camp. It was audacious, probably insane. It relied on the wolves continuing to tolerate human presence in their territory during a high-stress situation. It depended on the contractors behaving predictably, on the weather holding, on a dozen variables that could go catastrophically wrong. But it was also the kind of strategy her father would have recognized. Not conquest, not domination, just respect for the wilderness and trust that the environment would provide if approached correctly. Shun voiced what everyone was thinking. "Staff Sergeant, this plan requires the wolves to not only tolerate us, but actively help us. What if they do not? Then we adapt," Kira said. "But my father spent 30 years earning their trust. He died protecting them from exactly this kind of exploitation. I think they remember. I think they understand what is at stake." Outside, the amber-eyed wolf sat on the sanctuary steps, perfectly still, watching the southern approach where Apex vehicles would soon appear. And Kira understood that the point of no return had arrived. Whatever happened in the next hours would determine not just her survival, but whether her father's life work had meaning beyond his death. The Apex vehicles reached the Sanctuary Valley exactly 28 minutes after their ultimatum. Kira watched from a concealed position 200 yards into the forest as the contractors deployed with military precision. 23 personnel by her count, all armed, all moving with the confidence of professionals who had never encountered resistance they could not overwhelm. What they did not know was that they were being watched by more than just 6 soldiers. The wolf pack had dispersed throughout the forest in a pattern that Kira recognized from her father's journals. Hunting formation, not for prey, but for territorial defense. The amber-eyed leader sat on a ridgeline directly above the sanctuary buildings, perfectly silhouetted against the gray sky. The contractor team leader, identifiable by his command radio and superior equipment, approached the main building cautiously. He sent 4 soldiers ahead to clear the structure while the rest established a perimeter. Kira waited, her hand on the first tripwire mechanism her father had designed. Not yet. Patience was as much a survival skill as any other. The advanced team entered the building. 30 seconds later, they emerged, signaling all clear. The team leader moved forward with the main group. That was when Kira pulled the first wire. The flare detonated with a crack that echoed off the valley walls, followed immediately by 2 more in rapid succession. The light was blinding even in daylight, designed to overwhelm night vision equipment that the contractors had optimized for low-light operations. Smoke grenades ignited simultaneously from 3 different positions, filling the valley with thick white clouds that turned the sanctuary into a maze of zero visibility. And then the wolves began to howl. Not the distant calling that humans found haunting, but harmless. This was close, immediate, the sound of predators surrounding prey. The contractors could not see the pack through the smoke, but they could hear them from every direction, creating the acoustic impression of dozens of animals, when in reality, there were perhaps 12. Kira heard shouting through the chaos, orders being given, soldiers trying to regroup, confusion spreading through what had been a disciplined formation. She moved through the forest using the paths her father had mapped, placing additional noise makers and triggering diversionary effects that kept the contractors focused on threats that did not exist while the real danger went unnoticed. Reyes and Shun worked the eastern perimeter, using the terrain advantages to channel the contractors away from the escape routes. The forest here was dense enough that the vehicles could not follow, forcing Apex personnel to pursue on foot through snow that was waist-deep in places. Every 100 yards, Kira's team left evidence of their passage. Obvious tracks, discarded equipment, breadcrumbs that led deeper into terrain where the contractors' advantages disappeared and the wilderness reasserted control. By the time the smoke cleared, the Apex team had scattered into 3 separate groups, each pursuing what they thought was a fleeing soldier. What they were actually following were carefully laid trails that converged on a section of forest her father had marked with a warning in his journal. Unstable ground, permafrost layer compromised by underground water flow. Safe in winter when everything was frozen solid, but dangerous during temperature fluctuations. The temperature had been fluctuating for 3 days. The brief warm spell that had preceded the latest cold snap had destabilized the very foundation the contractors were walking on. Kira watched from high ground as the first contractor broke through. One moment, he was running through snow. The next, he had dropped to his chest in slush and mud that had no bottom, his legs vanishing into earth that had turned liquid beneath its frozen crust. His teammates rushed to help, and 2 more broke through. Within minutes, 8 contractors were trapped in varying degrees, their heavy equipment dragging them down in a cold mud that sapped body heat with terrifying efficiency. The team leader's voice crackled over their radios, audible even at Kira's distance. Pull back. All units pull back to vehicles. This operation is scrubbed, but pulling back meant admitting defeat to an enemy they had never even engaged directly. It meant returning to whoever had hired them and explaining that 6 isolated soldiers had routed a superior force using nothing but wilderness knowledge and psychological warfare. Kira knew the type. The team leader would not accept that outcome without one final attempt to salvage the situation. She was right. Instead of retreating, he redirected his remaining 15 contractors to converge on the sanctuary buildings. If they could not capture Kira's team, they would seize her father's research materials and destroy the facility. Scorched earth when victory proved impossible. Kira keyed her radio to the frequency she had been monitoring. Shun, Reyes, execute Phase 2. We're going to give them exactly what they are looking for. The team had prepared for this contingency. While the contractors had been scattered through the forest, Kira's soldiers had returned to the sanctuary and removed every journal, every map, every piece of research her father had compiled. In their place, they left convincing decoys, blank journals with weathered covers, maps that showed generic topography without the crucial annotations that made them valuable, documentation that looked legitimate until examined closely. The Apex team leader reached the sanctuary and immediately ordered his soldiers to collect everything. They worked quickly, efficiently, loading boxes of materials that they believed represented 30 years of irreplaceable research. They never looked up at the ridgeline where the amber-eyed wolf sat watching, never noticed that the forest had gone completely silent in the way that only happened when apex predators were moving into position. Kira gave the signal. Her team, now reunited and positioned in a loose semicircle around the valley, triggered the final phase. Not flares or smoke this time. Sound. Her father had discovered that wolves responded to specific frequency patterns, communication methods that predated human language. He had recorded those patterns, created devices that could replicate them. Devices that now broadcast through speakers hidden throughout the forest. The wolf pack responded as her father's notes had predicted. They emerged from the treeline as a unified force, moving with the fluid coordination of a hunting party that had worked together for decades. 23 contractors armed with modern weapons faced 12 wolves who knew this terrain in ways that transcended mapping or tactical analysis. The contractors did not fire. To their credit, they recognized that shooting would be useless at best and catastrophic at worst. Instead, they retreated to their vehicles with the boxes they thought contained valuable intelligence. The team leader cast one final look at the sanctuary, his expression promising that this was not over. Then the vehicles withdrew, taking their trapped personnel and their worthless cargo back toward whatever base of operations had launched them. Silence settled over the valley. The wolves did not pursue. They simply watched, ensuring the threat had truly departed. Then, one by one, they melted back into the forest until only the leader remained. The amber-eyed wolf looked directly at Kira's position, though she was concealed and downwind. It dipped its head once, a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement, then turned and disappeared. Kira emerged from cover and keyed her radio. All units converge on base camp location. We need to verify our people are safe and extract before Apex realizes they have been played. The team moved out, traveling fast through terrain they now understood intimately. The base camp was 3 hours away by the direct route, 2 if they used the wolf paths. They chose speed over caution, driven by the knowledge that 6 of their soldiers had been unaccounted for throughout the entire engagement. They found the base camp in disarray, but intact. The 6 soldiers were alive, shaken but unharmed. Apex had arrived there first, demanding surrender and threatening violence. But when the contractors received word that the sanctuary team was escaping, they had abandoned the base camp to give chase. The smoke Kira had seen had been a signal fire the soldiers built to warn her, not evidence of destruction. Corporal Reyes stood beside her as they surveyed the reunited team. 13 soldiers, exhausted and filthy, but alive and victorious through methods that no conventional military manual would have approved. Your father was right, Reyes said quietly. Respect works better than force. The wolves could have torn those contractors apart. Instead, they just encouraged them to leave. That is power without violence. That is strength without cruelty. Kira thought about the wolf that should not exist, about her father's choice 35 years earlier, about the chain of consequences that had led to this moment. We still have to deal with Hutchins, she said. He authorized Apex access. He sabotaged our mission. He put 13 soldiers at risk to acquire research he could weaponize for profit. That requires accountability. Chun joined them, holding something he had found in the base camp supplies. It was a small recording device, military grade, the kind used for mission documentation. But this one had been running continuously since their deployment. Every conversation, every order from Hutchins, every refusal of medical evacuation, all recorded with timestamp and GPS coordinates. I think your father would call this insurance, Chun said, handing her the device. Evidence that Hutchins cannot deny or destroy. Proof of everything he did. Kira closed her hand around the recorder. The truth about her father, the wolves, the sanctuary. That would remain protected, hidden in the wilderness where it belonged. But the truth about Hutchins and his conspiracy with Apex. That truth was about to become very public, very quickly. The extraction helicopters arrived exactly on schedule, 14 days after the mission began. 3 Chinooks touched down at the designated coordinates, their presence signaling that someone at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson had finally decided to verify the status of a training exercise that had gone suspiciously silent. Kira's team loaded their gear with the efficient movements of soldiers who had survived something that changed them fundamentally. Colonel Hutchins was not aboard any of the helicopters. Instead, a two-star general named Patricia Okafor emerged from the lead aircraft, her expression communicating that she was not here for pleasantries. She approached Kira directly, ignoring military protocol that would typically require a more formal greeting. Staff Sergeant Vance, General Okafor said, "You have had quite an adventure. I am here to conduct preliminary assessment before we determine what happened during your radio silence. I will need complete mission debriefing from you and your team." "Understood, Mom," Kira replied. She pulled the recording device from her pack and held it out. "This contains documentation of everything that occurred during our mission, including communications intercepts that I believe you will find relevant to your investigation." General Okafor took the device, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What exactly am I going to find on this recording, Staff Sergeant?" "Evidence of deliberate equipment sabotage, unauthorized coordination with private military contractors, and refusal of medical evacuation that endangered soldier welfare," Kira said, "all attributable to Colonel Bradford Hutchins." The general's expression did not change, but something shifted in her posture. "Get your team loaded," she ordered. "You're all coming back to base for medical evaluation and formal debriefing. And Staff Sergeant, you will ride with me. We have things to discuss." The flight back to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson took 90 minutes. General Okafor spent the first 30 listening to the recording in silence, her face growing progressively harder as Hutchins' voice detailed his plans to isolate Kira's team and facilitate Apex access to restricted territory. When the recording reached the point where Hutchins refused Davidson's medical evacuation, the general stopped playback. "How is Specialist Davidson?" she asked. "Stable and recovering according to Alaska Rescue 7's latest update," Kira replied. "He will need surgery and extensive rehabilitation, but the paramedics said we got him out just in time. Another 6 hours, and he would have lost the leg. Because you violated protocol and used civilian rescue services instead of military channels," General Okafor said. "It was not quite a question. Because Colonel Hutchins created a situation where following protocol meant watching a soldier die," Kira replied. "I chose to save my soldier over protecting my career. I would make the same choice again." The general studied her for a long moment. "Your father would have done the same thing," she finally said. "James Vance trained half the Arctic operations specialists in this command. He had a reputation for prioritizing soldier welfare over bureaucratic convenience. It made him difficult to work with but impossible to dismiss. I see he passed that trait along." She restarted the recording and listened through to the end. When it concluded, she sat in silence while the helicopter engines droned and Alaska's wilderness passed below them. Finally, she spoke again. "There's going to be an investigation," she said. "Multiple investigations, actually. Inspector General will review the equipment failures. Criminal Investigation Command will examine the Apex involvement. And I will personally ensure that Colonel Hutchins answers for every decision documented on this recording. You understand that your career will be scrutinized as well. You made unconventional choices, entered restricted territory, used unauthorized communication equipment. These actions will require justification. I can justify every decision I made," Kira said. "I kept 13 soldiers alive in conditions designed to ensure our failure. I protected classified wilderness research from commercial exploitation. And I gathered evidence of corruption that reaches beyond one officer's personal vendetta. My career can withstand scrutiny." "Good," General Okafor said, "because you're going to need that confidence. Colonel Hutchins has powerful allies. Private contractors like Apex have contracts throughout the military. There will be pressure to minimize this incident, to treat it as unfortunate miscommunication rather than deliberate malfeasance. You will face that pressure directly." "Then I will face it," Kira replied. "My father spent 30 years protecting something that mattered. He died defending it. I am not going to let his sacrifice become meaningless because accountability is politically inconvenient." The helicopters landed at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson to an unusual reception. Instead of the routine arrival processing, military police were waiting. But they were not there for Kira's team. As the soldiers disembarked, MPs moved past them toward the administration building, where Colonel Hutchins maintained his office. Whatever General Okafor had communicated during the flight, it had triggered immediate action. Kira watched through the terminal windows as Hutchins was escorted from the building in handcuffs. His face was rigid with fury, but he did not resist. He saw her watching, and for a moment their eyes met. The hatred in his expression was absolute, but beneath it Kira detected something else. Fear. The recognition that he had underestimated her the same way he had underestimated her father. Corporal Reyes stood beside her, also watching. "Is it over?" he asked. "The investigation is just beginning," Kira replied. "But the part where he controlled the narrative ended the moment we came back alive with evidence. Now he has to answer questions instead of asking them." Over the next week, Kira gave testimony to 4 separate investigative bodies. She described the equipment failures, the coordinate discrepancies, the medical evacuation refusal. She provided detailed accounts of the Apex incursion and her team's defensive response. What she did not discuss was the wolves. That remained protected information, documented only in journals that she had secured in locations where investigators would never find them. The inquiry board consisted of 3 colonels and General Okafor. They reviewed every aspect of the mission with meticulous attention. On the 5th day, they called Kira in for final testimony. Staff Sergeant Vance, the senior colonel, began, "Your actions during this mission were unorthodox, to say the least. You violated restricted area protocols. You utilized unauthorized communication systems. You coordinated with civilian rescue services without military approval. By conventional standards, these are serious infractions. However," he paused, consulting notes before continuing, "you also demonstrated exceptional leadership under adverse conditions. You preserved the lives of all 13 soldiers in your command despite deliberate sabotage of your equipment and resources. You gathered critical intelligence regarding unauthorized contractor operations in protected territory. And you exposed corruption that has implications reaching far beyond this single incident. The board finds that your actions, while unconventional, were justified by circumstances and consistent with the highest traditions of military service." General Okafor spoke next. "Colonel Hutchins has been relieved of command pending court-martial proceedings. The charges include conspiracy, dereliction of duty, and endangerment of personnel under his authority. Apex Security Solutions is under federal investigation for unauthorized operations in restricted military zones. Their contracts with the Department of Defense have been suspended." She looked directly at Kira. "Your father's research materials have been classified at the highest level. The sanctuary zone will remain restricted with enhanced security protocols. And you, Staff Sergeant Vance, are being assigned to develop new Arctic survival training doctrine based on your family's methodology. Consider it official recognition that respect for the environment produces better outcomes than attempting to dominate it." The formal proceedings concluded. Kira walked out of the hearing room to find her entire team waiting in the hallway. 13 soldiers who had survived impossible conditions and emerged stronger. They stood at attention as she approached, then broke into applause that echoed through the corridor. Specialist Chen stepped forward. "We heard the verdict, Staff Sergeant. Congratulations. You earned it." "We earned it," Kira corrected. "Every one of you performed beyond expectations. You trusted methods that probably seemed insane. You adapted when plans changed. You survived because you worked as a team and respected the environment you were operating in. That is what I'm going to teach in the new training program. Not just survival skills, but the philosophy behind them." That evening, alone in her quarters, Kira opened her father's journals one final time. She turned to the last page he had written, the entry that ended with his request to the wolf. Below his final words, she added her own. "Mission complete, Dad. The sanctuary is protected. Hutchins is facing justice. And the wolf kept its promise. I understand now what you were trying to teach me. Survival is not about being the strongest or the most heavily armed. It is about understanding your environment well enough to move through it as a partner rather than an invader." The wolf knew that 35 years ago. You knew it your entire life. Now I know it too. Your daughter always. She closed the journal and looked out her window toward the Alaska Range. Somewhere in those mountains, a pack of wolves moved through their ancient patterns. And somewhere among them, an impossible animal with amber eyes continued the work of protecting a wilderness that held secrets beyond human understanding. 3 months after the mission ended, Kira stood in front of a classroom at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson addressing 42 soldiers who had volunteered for the new Arctic Survival Doctrine program. The curriculum she had developed drew directly from her father's journals, translating 30 years of wilderness philosophy into practical training that emphasized environmental partnership over domination. The Army had approved the program with surprising speed, though Kira suspected General Okafor had used considerable influence to push it through bureaucratic resistance. Survival in extreme environments is not about conquest, she told the assembled soldiers. It is about understanding. The wilderness does not care about your rank or your equipment or your mission objectives. It operates according to principles that existed long before humans arrived and will continue long after we are gone. Your job is to learn those principles well enough to move through hostile terrain as a guest rather than an invader. Corporal Reyes, now promoted to sergeant, sat in the front row. He had requested assignment as her primary instructor, bringing the credibility of someone who had survived the methods she was teaching. Beside him sat Specialist Chun and 4 other members of the original mission team. They had all volunteered to help build the program, united by shared experience that transcended normal unit cohesion. The training facility itself was located on the edge of the base, designed to simulate the conditions soldiers would face in actual Arctic deployments. But Kira had insisted on one modification that raised eyebrows among the traditional instructors. Large windows on the northern wall looked directly toward the Alaska Range, providing constant visual reminder of the wilderness they were preparing to enter. She wanted students to see the mountains every day to develop respect for the environment before they ever set foot in it. After the morning session concluded, Kira met with General Okafor in the facility's administrative office. The general had become an unexpected ally, someone who understood that innovation sometimes required protecting unconventional thinkers from institutional resistance. Your first class is exceeding expectations, the general said, reviewing the performance metrics on her tablet. Retention rates are higher than standard Arctic training. Skill acquisition is faster. And perhaps most importantly, injury rates during field exercises are dramatically lower. Whatever you're teaching them, it works. I'm teaching them what my father taught me, Kira replied. That fear and force create rigid responses that break under pressure. Understanding and respect create flexible responses that adapt to changing conditions. The wilderness rewards flexibility. General Okafor set down the tablet. I received the final report on Colonel Hutchins this morning. Court-martial concluded. Dishonorable discharge. 15 years in military prison for conspiracy, dereliction of duty, and endangerment. Apex Security Solutions lost all federal contracts, and 3 executives are facing criminal charges. Justice was served. Kira felt satisfaction, but not triumph. Hutchins had destroyed his own career through choices driven by greed and resentment. She had simply ensured those choices had consequences. What about the sanctuary? She asked. Permanently restricted, the general confirmed. Enhanced security. Regular patrols. And your father's research has been classified at a level that ensures it stays protected. The official designation is Ecological Preservation Zone, but the real reason is what your father documented about the wildlife behavior patterns. The brass does not understand it, but they recognize it has strategic value that should not be commercialized. They spoke for another hour about program expansion, budget allocations, and long-term planning. The Arctic Survival Doctrine was scheduled to become mandatory training for all soldiers deploying to cold weather environments within 2 years. Kira's unorthodox methods would soon be standard military practice. Her father's philosophy institutionalized in ways he never sought but would have appreciated. That evening, Kira visited Specialist Davidson at the base medical facility. He was 3 months into rehabilitation, learning to walk again after surgery had reconstructed his knee. The doctors predicted he would make full recovery, though his days of field operations were likely over. He had requested transfer to Training Command, hoping to work with Kira's program once he completed physical therapy. "Staff Sergeant," he said as she entered his room, "I heard the news about Hutchins. 15 years. That is justice." "It is consequence," Kira replied. "Justice is you walking again. Justice is our team coming home alive. The rest is just accountability for someone who forgot that leadership means protecting the people under your command, not sacrificing them for personal gain." Davidson nodded toward the window where snow was falling in thick curtains. "I've been thinking about what happened out there. The wolves. The way they helped us. I know the official reports do not mention it, but I saw what I saw. That pack was not acting like normal wildlife. They were coordinating with us, protecting us. How is that possible?" Kira chose her words carefully. "My father spent 30 years building trust with that ecosystem. He demonstrated through consistent action that humans could be partners rather than threats. The wolves learned to recognize that partnership and honor it. Whether that is behavioral conditioning or something more complex, I cannot say, but I know it was real. I know it saved our lives." "Will you teach that in your program?" Davidson asked. "The partnership approach." "I'm teaching it already," Kira said, "just in ways that do not require explaining impossible wolves to skeptical commanders. The principles remain the same. Respect, observation, adaptation. Students do not need to know about the sanctuary to benefit from the philosophy it represents." Over the following weeks, the program continued to grow. Soldiers who completed the training reported feeling more confident in wilderness environments, better able to read terrain and weather, more capable of making decisions that prioritize survival over ego. The injury rates spoke for themselves. Traditional Arctic training had averaged 12 significant injuries per cycle. Kira's approach had recorded 0. On a cold March morning, General Okafor summoned Kira to her office. When she arrived, she found the general standing beside someone in civilian clothes. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and weathered hands that spoke of decades of outdoor work. "Staff Sergeant Vance," General Okafor said, "this is Dr. Sarah Chun. She worked with your father for 15 years studying Arctic ecology. She has something for you." Dr. Chun stepped forward and handed Kira a sealed envelope. "Your father left this in my care with instructions to give it to you if certain conditions were met. Those conditions have now been satisfied. He wanted you to have this when you were ready to understand what he truly protected in the sanctuary." Kira opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed her father standing in the sanctuary valley, the amber-eyed wolf sitting calmly beside him like a trusted companion. The date stamp indicated it was taken 2 weeks before his death. The letter was brief. "Kira, if you're reading this, you have walked the path I walked. You have earned the wolf's trust as I did. You have protected the sanctuary from those who would exploit it. Now you must decide what to do with the knowledge I am about to share. The wolf is not one animal living impossibly long. It is a bloodline that has passed guardianship of the sanctuary through generations, each new leader inheriting the bond one established with the original. They remember because they teach their young to remember. They honor the agreement because their survival depends on it, just as ours depends on them. This is not science I can publish, not truth I can prove to skeptics, but it is real and it matters. The wilderness has intelligence beyond what our instruments can measure. The question is whether we respect that intelligence or try to dissect it. Ich chose respect. I trust you will too." Kira looked up from the letter to find both General Okafor and Dr. Chun watching her carefully. "You knew about this," she said. "About the wolves, the bloodline, the agreement." Dr. Chun nodded. "I knew. I helped your father document it, though we never published the findings. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share publicly, but it needs to be preserved for those who will continue the protection work." General Okafor spoke next. "The Army does not officially recognize what your father discovered, but unofficially, we understand that some strategic assets cannot be quantified or explained through conventional analysis. The sanctuary remains protected because results matter more than explanations. Your training program works because it is based on principles that are true whether or not we understand the mechanisms behind them. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Kira. Inside was a promotion order. Effective immediately, Kira was being promoted to Sergeant First Class and given command of the Arctic Survival Doctrine Program with authority to expand it service-wide. Her father's name would be on the official program designation, the James Vance Arctic Partnership Initiative. Your father changed how we think about wilderness survival, General Okafor said. You're going to ensure that change becomes permanent, that soldiers learn to work with their environment instead of fighting it. That respect replaces domination as our primary operational philosophy. This is your legacy now, Staff Sergeant. Use it well. 6 months after the mission that changed everything, Kira received special authorization to return to the sanctuary. It was late September, the brief Alaska autumn painting the tundra in shades of crimson and gold before winter reclaimed the landscape. She traveled alone, carrying only a small pack and the urn containing her father's ashes that had waited 3 years for this final journey. The helicopter pilot who flew her was the same woman who had evacuated Davidson, the one who had known her father during his wilderness guide years. She set the aircraft down in the sanctuary valley with the gentle precision of someone who understood that this place deserved respect. I will wait here, the pilot said as Kira disembarked. Take whatever time you need. Your father was a good man. He deserves a proper farewell. The sanctuary buildings stood exactly as Kira had left them, maintained by periodic patrols that ensured the facility remained functional. But she had not come for the buildings. She walked past them, following the trail her father had marked in his journals, moving deeper into the wilderness he had spent 30 years protecting. The wolf was waiting at the edge of the tree line. Not the entire pack, just the leader. The dark coat was silver now at the muzzle, showing age that should have claimed the animal years ago. But the amber eyes were unchanged, still holding that impossible depth of awareness that transcended normal wildlife behavior. Kira approached slowly, stopping 20 feet away. The wolf did not retreat. It sat, patient and still, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Thank you, Kira said quietly, for honoring the agreement, for protecting my team, for remembering my father. The wolf tilted its head in that gesture she had come to recognize. Not acknowledgement exactly, but communication in a language that existed beyond words. She opened her pack and removed the urn, along with her father's compass and the original journal he had carried for 40 years. She had chosen a spot her father had described in his final entries. A clearing near the sanctuary's heart where sunlight filtered through spruce branches and the sound of a small creek provided constant gentle music. It was a place of peace, the kind of location her father would have selected for himself if given the choice. Kira opened the urn and began scattering the ashes. They caught the breeze, dispersing across ground that had shaped her father's life work. As she completed the ritual, she spoke words she had been preparing for 3 years. You taught me that survival is about partnership, she said. That respect creates stronger bonds than force ever could. That the wilderness is not an enemy to conquer, but a teacher to learn from. I did not understand when I was young. I thought you were being soft, sentimental. I see now that you were being wise. She placed the compass and journal at the base of a large spruce tree, items that had guided her father through thousands of miles of trackless wilderness. They would remain here, weathering into the landscape they had helped him navigate, returning to the earth that had sustained him. The sanctuary is protected, she continued. Your research is classified and safe. The wolf pack has enhanced legal protection, and your methods are being taught to soldiers across the entire Arctic Operations Command. The James Vance Arctic Partnership Initiative is changing how the military approaches wilderness survival. You won, Dad. Your philosophy survived, and it is making soldiers better at staying alive. Movement at the tree line caught her attention. The rest of the pack emerged, perhaps a dozen wolves ranging from adolescents to adults. They formed a loose semicircle, watching with that same patient awareness she had seen in the leader. And among them, she noticed 3 pups. The next generation, already learning the patterns that would allow them to continue the guardianship their bloodline had maintained for decades. The amber-eyed leader stood and walked forward until only 10 feet separated them. Kira remained motionless, hardly breathing, as the animal that should not exist studied her with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of a partnership spanning 35 years. Then the wolf did something that made her breath catch. It stepped forward and touched its nose briefly to her outstretched hand before backing away. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in that moment, Kira felt the weight of the agreement transfer. Not ownership or control, but mutual recognition. The wolves would continue protecting the sanctuary. She would continue protecting them. The partnership her father had forged would extend into the next generation on both sides. The pack turned as one and disappeared into the forest, the pups following their elders into shadows that swallowed them completely. Only the leader remained for a final moment, looking back at Kira with what could only be called farewell. Then it too vanished, leaving her alone in a clearing that held her father's ashes and the echo of an impossible promise kept. Kira returned to the helicopter as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. The pilot looked up from her tablet as Kira climbed aboard. "Everything's settled?" she asked. "Everything's settled," Kira confirmed. The flight back to base was quiet. Kira watched the wilderness pass below, an endless expanse of mountains and forests that had shaped her family for 2 generations. Somewhere down there, wolves were moving through their ancient patterns, teaching their young the skills needed to survive in one of Earth's harshest environments. And mixed into those lessons was something else. The knowledge that humans could be partners when they approached with respect instead of weapons. Back at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Kira found Sergeant Reyes waiting at the landing pad. "The new class starts tomorrow," he said. 48 students this cycle. Biggest group yet. They are all excited to learn from the legend who survived the impossible mission. "I'm not a legend," Kira said. "I'm just someone who learned that my father was right about almost everything." "That makes you a legend in my book," Reyes replied with a grin. "Come on. The team is waiting at the facility. We have final prep to complete before tomorrow." The Arctic Survival Doctrine facility was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Instructors were setting up equipment. Administrative staff were processing incoming students. And on the wall of the main classroom, newly installed that afternoon, was a photograph. Her father in his prime, standing in the wilderness he had loved, his face showing the quiet confidence of someone who understood their purpose completely. Below the photograph, a brass plaque read, "James Vance, pioneer of Arctic Partnership Doctrine. The wilderness is not our enemy. It is our teacher." Kira stood before the image, remembering the man who had spent countless hours teaching her to read animal tracks before she could read words, who had shown her that survival was about observation and adaptation rather than domination, who had made an impossible choice 35 years ago and trusted that the consequences would unfold correctly across decades. Staff Sergeant Vance, one of the new instructors, called. "We need your approval on the final lesson plan." She turned away from the photograph, ready to begin the work of ensuring her father's legacy lived in practice rather than just memory. Tomorrow, 48 soldiers would start learning that the wilderness rewarded respect, that partnership created better outcomes than conquest, that sometimes the most important survival skill was knowing when to lower your weapon instead of firing it. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. In the Alaska range, wolves howled their evening chorus, a sound that had echoed through these mountains long before humans arrived and would continue long after. And somewhere in the sanctuary, in a clearing marked only by a compass and a journal weathering into soil, the wind carried ashes that had once been a man who understood that true strength came from knowing when to be gentle. If this story moved you, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or character, or share if you have witnessed the kind of quiet courage and respect for nature that James and Kira Vance embodied. Sometimes the most powerful victories come not from dominating our environment, but from learning to move through it as partners. The story of the wolf and the soldier had come full circle. The agreement held. And in classrooms across military bases, a new generation was learning that survival belonged to those who respected the wilderness enough to learn from it.